Welcome back to TED Talk 2 on community enablement. My name is John Comber. I'm the ex-chief exec of the London Borough of Greenwich, Royal Borough of Greenwich, and I'm here with a panel, two physically, one virtually. We've got Joanne Harding, executive member, Adult Social Care, Trafford Council. We've got Andrew Lana, chief exec of iESE, and we have John Henderson virtually joining us, chief executive at Staffordshire County Council. So welcome to the panel and thank you for being here. You know from previous TED Talks you are able to ask questions, which I will refer to as we go through the session. And I'll start by setting out a little why we're talking about community enablement in a conference which is about the power of purpose. iESE in 2015 undertook a piece of research involving more than 100 councils that identified that there were trends of which level a council was at in terms of being a producer of services, a customer-centric organisation trying to put the customer at the heart of everything they do, and then a level 3, which was about trying to take and divert need so that the community were able to deal with that need themselves and didn't need the intervention of the local authority. And it's a very different thing to have a council that is totally in one of those levels. Normally, we found that there is a mix of those levels within every council. But what we talked about in the opening conversation of this conference was if the purpose of a council is to become community enabled, to enable its community to have the capacity to help itself, then what do you do? And this segment is really to ask the panel to consider what might a council do to enable its community, to build the capacity in its community, to be able to deal with more of its need. What can the council do to promote its other stakeholders in its geographic area to get involved in acting as a catalyst for dealing with that need? And what is the role that members and officers of a council can play directly in facilitating that to come about? Having talked about the characteristics of community enablement and what they might be, what I'm going to do is turn to each of the panel members in turn and ask them for a view to get us started on what the best way of dealing with community enablement might be. And Andrew, I suspect best to start with you. Community enablement, what does it mean to you? What has come out of the research and what have you learned subsequently about what authorities are doing, what best practice is out there?
Yeah, thanks, John. I mean, it is very much, as you say, a work in progress for the sector and never more important than now. But for me, it is about the community being a vibrant community and resilient, by which I mean in sort of the psychology definition is that when there is some kind of adversity, it bounces back quickly because you can't be perfect all the time. And therefore, you know, from a local authority point of view, in terms of community enablement, you have to rethink then, well, so what is my role in that? Because actually, you need to be looking at the horizon and saying, what are the things that might need resilience? And you also need to think, what are the ingredients in my community that make it vibrant, and how can I be the grit in the oyster? How can I actually make those conditions more likely to come about, rather than, oh, I'll meet the need or I'll produce something. So it's a very different relationship, and that's really the starting point. And you know, there are some great examples around the country doing that in different ways, and I think we're learning from all of them.
Joanna, to you, what would community enablement be, and how might you go about achieving it?
So I think for me, the first thing that local government and local authorities should do is trust the residents. I think that's a key thing and a key ingredient about, you know, how we bring about community enablement. All too often, we can be very prescriptive in local government. We do things to people and for people. But actually, if we think about some of the things that have happened throughout this pandemic and the way communities have stepped up, the outpouring of kindness and compassion, and they have found their own solutions to some of these, some of the adversities that we have faced and will continue to face as we head into winter. And certainly in Trafford, I can give a great example of the 6 community hubs that we have, where communities have come together and continue to do so. But a key ingredient in that is that we have to think about our role and relinquishing some of those powers back to communities, and a key word is trust. Yep. It's vital.
Thank you. And John, in terms of community enablement, what does it mean to you?
Well, it's following on from Jan and Andrew, I think very similar experience. And I would frame it against the experience of the last 7 months in the COVID response. And, what we've been astounded by is the way that local groups have come together and have taken on, in large part, much of the response, and particularly around isolation, or reducing isolation. For the clinically extremely vulnerable and other cohorts like that. I think it's been quite inspirational, and actually Andrew helped us very much when we're still working on it, is that we're what they call traditionally a 2-tier area, but actually the reality is we're a 3-tier area, because we've got parish and town councils, and those parish and town councils have a really important role because they're really connected locally. But those community groups, just come back to them for a second, it's very much, Jan was saying that, is about trusting people and actually accepting that they're volunteers and they're not going to do 100% of what the council wants. We just have to live with the fact that maybe 70% of what we want them to do is good enough, and that they're doing it within their communities, and maybe they know best.
And I think that's a very interesting point. How much should a local authority deliver services? There's been arguments before when we've looked at efficiencies and cuts about paring back to just statutory service delivery. How do you build community capacity in a world where budgets are very tight, needs very high? Where do you start? Is it the pandemic has caused or the beginnings of a revolution, or are there other things we can do to make it happen?
I think for me, there's something fundamentally different about looking at the design of what a local authority is and how it works. I mean, essentially, if you look at the last 10 years, that we would have said, actually, we started out austerity with leaning and business process re-engineering and actually taking individual authority services and trying to optimise them to the nth degree. And then we've moved then into that customer-centric world of actually, let's make that engagement simpler from the customer's point of view. Actually, what we've done is joined up the queues, and we're doing things slightly differently. What we actually need to do is those different things that prevent demand, meet need in the first place. So you've almost got to deconstruct every service, not just the obvious ones like the care, health engagement, everything right through to the regulatory service, including planning, and say, actually, how do I deconstruct this so that the service itself is no longer needed at a fundamental level? And you can do that, and you can do it in a way that when you get that right, actually releases resource. And it releases resource to the benefit of the community. So it's a win-win, generates income and resilience, further resilience in the community, and actually reduces costs to local authority. And you've seen it in simple stuff like planning applications, where if you remove the stuff that isn't needed and put it under local control in the community, actually turns a planning department from consuming £1 million worth of corporate funding to actually generating a surplus of £500,000. That's the sort of thing you can do right across the authority. But it's a fundamentally different design principle, and it's an exciting one to deploy.
Many would say it's easy in some of those repetitive services which deliver the same thing time and again, but much more difficult in adult social care or children's services. What would you say to that?
So it's really interesting, actually, because clearly adult social care is my portfolio area, and for years we've had an underfunded and under-resourced social care, and lots of dialogue about green papers and fair funding and so on, and hopefully that will come from this. But public health now, if not now, when? Because we've all seen how public health and our colleagues in directors of public health have stepped up. They've done an incredible job across the country. But I think we talk about prevention, we talk about health inequalities, and we talk about it a lot. Let's face it, there's lots of talk, but we now have an opportunity to flick that switch to prevention. And I think about models like Good Neighbours, the mutual aid networks that have stepped up, that are about looking after somebody who might not need social care, at this point, but might do in the future. But if we start doing some of that work with communities and supporting people to stay at home independently, then I think, you know, you can start to reduce the demand on some of those services because we build those resilient communities where neighbours look after each other. So it is possible in social care. And another example is really of the delayed transfers of care. For years, that has been an issue where we have battled to get people out of hospital. Incredibly, as soon as the pandemic started, people were out of hospital very quickly and into discharge to assess, into different settings where we could look at what future needs are. We have to stop putting up those unnecessary barriers sometimes. It's an opportunity to smash all that down now and think about how we do things differently.
John, as the Chief Exec, do you see it more difficult to manage in a community-enabled world, or is it helpful?
No, I don't. I would agree with you know what Joanne and Andrew said. You know, it's what we've really got is, and we talk in Staffordshire, and it's not an original concept, about the pyramid of need. So effectively, at the bottom you have the sort of services and activities you do for everyone, and then there's the sort of higher level of need where some people need them, and then there's a few people need really, you know, concentrated interventions. And the reality is, at the top of the pyramid, we're always going to be involved in that, whether it's in children's services, adult social care, you know, looking after the disabled, or in any other of the place-based services as well, you know, like highways, etc. But as you come down that pyramid, if you get it right, and it's something we're pioneering in our children's area, is a place-based approach. And the idea is to try and engage at the bottom level so that you get communities involved and you start sort of, if you can, stopping people from moving up that pyramid and needing more of those formal and those statutory services. And we found in places, actually, strangely enough, because initially we thought this is how people services go. But actually, the more we think about it, the more you can translate that into people. So if you're in a sort of semi-rural, and a lot of Staffordshire, but over 70% of Staffordshire is farmed. That was quite a surprise to me when I got to the county, was just how rural a county it is. And actually, what we found is a lot of parish and town councils start off by looking at place-based services. So they're interested in verges and they're interested in, you know, things like that are sort of, you know, whether it's gullies or roads or whatever it happens to be. But we found if you engage with them in those areas, you can then start to talk to them about doing more about people, and particularly around when the adult social care, about that bottom tier, if you like, that thing for all, about reducing isolation. Because if you can keep someone at home and happy for longer, that's got to be a good thing.
Does the culture of the organisation need to change to do that? And is there a fear attached to being more trusting of the community and allowing them to deliver services that it puts officers working in the council at risk?
Well, I think you're right, that there is a need, and it's something that certainly I've worked really hard. I've been here slightly over 5 years, and it's actually been really interesting. I personally, my leadership sort of mantra is I regard trust and confidence as relationships. So if I want people to trust me, the first thing I've got to do is trust them. And if I want people to be more confident, and that's what I do want my colleagues and the groups, etc., to be more confident, first thing I've got to do is show confidence in them. And if you can get that right, and that you just have to accept that not everything's going to go well, and some things are going to go wrong. And when they do, it's about solutions, not about pinning blame.
What's the role of data, Andrew, in a community-enabled authority? Because there's a lot of talk about prevention, there's a lot of talk about how do you predict what's coming, how do you do trend analysis? What's data got to do with this?
There's a number of different ways in which that occurs, and I can think of authorities from John's and his colleagues in South Staffordshire that I worked with, plus Barking and Dagenham, who we heard from earlier, and others who've kind of driven that. So at a process level, if you look at, for example, what Barking and Dagenham did, they took what you might call data feeds. They'd consider them now to be data feeds, but before would have been enactioned in a process. So if someone's arrears were showed up, then that's going into a legal process. Now those are all bits of intelligence that said, actually, there's a family here that might need some support. So that using it at that transactional level, but taking the current process and using it a different way. Then you get on to kind of medium-term, long-term, because you've got to think of it in terms of what are the things that might impact the pocket of my vulnerable in the community, whether they be businesses or people. And you can start to think about, if something happens, then what am I going to do? I may not know when it's going to happen, but you can start to scenario plan. You know, it would have been nice to scenario plan for a pandemic, wouldn't it? And actually, but if you start to think about those things, not just the plane crashing and the civil kind of response, but the equivalent of that, things that then, whether it be a large weather event and so on, actually start planning those through. And that starts to look at your kind of response and resilience as a whole and what you need to support that. And then, of course, there's long-term trends, things that you can see creeping up. We talked about the environment in the previous session, but actually, you know, do plot where you think the trajectory of costs of energy and costs of food and so on are going to go, and look at what that means to the shopping basket of your communities. And actually, if you then reinvent your procurement resource, you can actually start to apply that as a solution, a community service, rather than an internal regulatory service that's just ticking the boxes that you followed the right procurement process, which frankly we can automate a lot of anyway, and you can get then huge, great value out of that for the future of your community.
Can I kind of talk to both the points that were raised then, really? So I think for me, if we think about data and if we think about the role of the community, so one of the things that we must do as a council is think about the language we use to make ourselves accessible to communities. Because I think what's really important is if we ask people to take responsibility for their own health and well-being, and then we go, oh no, sorry, you can't do that. And if we talk about health inequalities and we look at the Marmot Review 10 years down the line, it's still saying the same things, if not worse. But none of that means anything to a family that's living in one of the most deprived wards. So Trafford is seen as an affluent borough, but it masks a lot of the poverty that is happening across Trafford. And what we need to do, so I think about the constitutional structures that we have, even that language, constitutional structures. If I was to say that to Barbara in my street, she would look at me like I was crazy. But we have a health and wellbeing board, and under those boards we have the sub-boards of Start Well, Live Well, Age Well. We have a health scrutiny committee. We invite the public to come along and we speak a language that nobody understands. But ultimately we say to people, take responsibility for your own health and well-being, but we speak a language and jargon that nobody apart from ourselves understand. So I think if we talk about community enablement, a key thing we need to do is the trust is essential, but language is absolutely essential, and we have to speak in a language that people understand. So if you talk about years of life lost, what does that mean? What it means to somebody who's living, for example, in Clifford, one of our most deprived wards, it means that if you don't eat well, if you live in a house which is damp and you have fuel poverty, if you are in a poorly paid job, that you will lose years of your life and you will live in ill health. But let's spell it out in a way that people understand and then support people to live better lives. It's just something I will always bang the drum for, the language that we use with our communities.
We've been asked a question about, given the local metropolitan election in 2018 only saw a turnout of 32%, how can local government become more relevant to their own communities? And certainly some of the research I've done around the future role of members for iESE has indicated that a lot of people wouldn't be able to pick out their local councillor in an identity parade. How do we get the role of local councillors appreciated and seen for what it really should be? How do we do that?
Well, do you want me to start as a local councillor?
I was going to say, sorry. I think, if I just may, sparing Joanne's blushes, I think councillors' reputation has gone up during this pandemic overall. I genuinely think that people now look to local government in a different way to perhaps what we did. And I'm not making a party political point. Local government has delivered, as a sector over the last 7 months. And we've all done it, regardless of whether we're metropolitans or whatever we happen to be, cities, counties, districts, people have really turned to, and it's been a really inspiring thing. And I certainly see it here. And our politicians talk about it. It's going to be really interesting. We've got a county council election next May. And of course, it's going to be a really unusual county council election because we don't actually know how we're going to be able to hold it yet. But the reality of life is, it'll be interesting to see what the turnout, because we're also sitting about 30% normally.
Well, I think absolutely right. Lots of councillors have stepped up. They're certainly more visible. And I think I read it yesterday about an LGA survey that 71% of the people who responded were generally satisfied with their local council. I think it's more about the accessibility, being transparent, and again, language. But remember that as councillors, you know, so a council is me, you, we, everybody. I'm a human being who lives in my community. So the services that we provide for other residents, I am also, you know, somebody that is in receipt of some of those services for some of the time. So I think really it's about a more human approach to local government, but you're absolutely right, local government has stepped up. And I think now the day where we, you know, the whole devolution agenda in Greater Manchester, where I'm from, looking at how we find our own bespoke solutions to the things that matter in our communities.
And John, in terms of staff, are your staff community ambassadors? Do they have a way of reporting back into the authority what they're feeling, what they're seeing as custodians and service?
I mean, it's been a, you know, I would share with you that, you know, I'm relatively new to local government. This is my first turn in. Prior to that, I spent slightly over 30 years in the army. This is a really different organisation to what I'm used to. Over 80% of my colleagues live and work in Staffordshire. So they're Staffordshire residents and, you know, so therefore they are ambassadors. If I could just go back, I think Jan's point about language is really important. I happen to be a linguist by background, and I think it's so important. And I think there's that external language to residents, but there's also an internal language. And having been a newcomer to this, it's interesting that the language of local government is not empowering. We talk about holding people to account and oversight and scrutiny. These are not empowering words and expressions. And they're really important, and it's really important we do it. But I think if we want people to take that thing and be that ambassador and do the right thing, we have to say to them, it's okay. You know, I've got your back.
And are we slipping backwards in local government with some waiting for the government to tell us what to do rather than just taking responsibility and getting on with it? I know, Andrew, you've got some views on this.
I think there's two. I think both are true. So if you look at the good bit, I think the way in which local government has been moving towards community enabling actually has been for a little while now. I think there's a lot of rich lessons there, and actually more that we can do to share those right across the UK. I mean, I'd like to I think the Scottish experience of the community plan and that being the centre of the world for them. I mean, it was a revelation when I spent a day with colleagues at East Ayrshire looking at their plans for what they were going to do. If I'd done that in an English council, you would have started with, this is our budget position, this is the amount of money we're going to save, and you'd have worked on out. We spent the first half day looking at the data analytics, looking at where the future needs of the community, looking at what the community is saying where their plans were, and then in the afternoon we got down to then, okay, so what do we do about it? What does that mean financially for us as a council? So I think there's lots of really good things about, not asking for permission, getting on with it. And I think up to the pandemic, I think that was true. I think there's some aspects of the response in the pandemic where I think because we've been reliant on government guidelines, there's been a sense at which we've got to do what we're told in the way that we're told to do it in some aspects, whether that be the protocols, etc. That I think we've lost something. I think the bit that we lost is the ability to look for best practice outside the country in particular. And I think and we'll come on to it later, don't want to steal the thunder of the later session on the panel. There are lots of solutions that have been deployed locally around the world that frankly remove risks of surface to human transmission and stuff that's coming along in the last month or so that remove the risk of aerosol transmission in buildings. And we haven't done what we would normally do, which is to grab those best practice lessons and steal them and apply them locally. We've been very insular as a sector in that regard. And that's not to decry the huge efforts that have gone in. And I think if there were one thing that I waved a magic wand on, it would be getting that international best practice and employing it now.
When we talk about community enablement, there's a danger that we're talking or seem to be talking about abdication of responsibility, about moving back because there isn't budget there and leaving people, vulnerable communities, hard to reach communities in more difficult circumstances. How do we deal with that when we're asking people to become more active citizens, that it isn't just seen as we can't deliver services, so we're just moving away? How do we stop that being one of the ways people might see an initiative like community enablement?
For me, there's a culture and behaviour issue in the authority and in the community, because there's a compact between two. We're certainly right with those councils where they are truly living community enablement. You can see it, touch it and breathe it in how the staff work and how they behave. And when you go out into the community with them, it's the community are running the community. You can see it. They are running their community, and officers are coming in to support them. And it's like old friends have come into the room, and and so their community plans that are coming up, they are really meaningful. And actually, if anything doesn't fit that, and then it's not about, it is plans plural. It's not a plan for the local authority area, each community, and so you can see it, touch it, and feel it. But I think to me, it's the behaviour. And I think other colleagues in the sector, Donna Hall and others, talk about seeing people as units of need is the traditional approach, and actually moving to actually think about strengths. This is going, I guess, a step beyond that and seeing the community and trusting the community to create that strength. And you're actually just sort of facilitating that. And once it's getting going, you need to be able to stand back and let it happen.
There's a question about communities that suffer from the highest levels of deprivation and need our help the most. How do we effectively engage these groups in the conversation? How do you get to those groups?
So I think for me, and it talks to some of the points that Andrew made really about the areas of innovation and some of the international examples. My fear is that we are so busy firefighting at the minute, and we're so busy dealing with the crisis as it unfolds and we go into another lockdown, that we are sometimes going to we're going to lose sight of those areas of innovation. So it's business as usual with crisis and firefighting, but actually we're not looking wider because we're all kind of down that rabbit hole, and I do understand that. But I think to your points about engaging some of those other communities and then finding solutions, it is about culture, and it's about how we commission. Again, we commission because we think it's what people need. Whereas actually, one of the things when we put a leaflet out about the community hubs, we spoke about things like language. Have we actually got that leaflet out in a language that people understand? Have we, we think that everybody is digitally connected and they've got access to the local Facebook pages or a Twitter account. They simply don't. So by going in and working with some of those faith-based communities, because a lot of our communities, again, are like Clifford and Longford wards, where we have the mosque, we've got a big Polish community, we've got Jewish communities. We have to think about the way we engage, make it a bespoke offer, and not just the local government standard, this is how we do it. It's having a different message to meet the different needs of different populations.
John, when you're dealing with town and parish councils, that must make it a far more interesting proposition.
Well, it is. I mean, there's over 250 town and parish councils in Staffordshire. And so it becomes quite a complex. But again, it's that thing of not trying to control it all. And it's really interesting, just picking up on what Joanne said. It's not just about the language and the way. It's actually about the approach. And I'd cite two examples. One was before my time, and one that was kept going in my time. And it was youth clubs, youth service, and then libraries. And as a result of austerity, it was decided that they were going to be, effectively, we were going to hand over all the youth centres, get out of formal youth provision, and we would try and do as many community-led libraries as we possibly could. That kind of developed as we got into it, into a far more sophisticated approach. And the youth service has been a real success. I'm not going it because it's before my time. It's now doing far more Duke of Edinburgh awards than it was when it was under our control, and it's run entirely by local groups and local individuals. The trick is going to be keeping that going once the initial people start to sort of drop out of that, and keeping that supply chain, if you like, of good people. But the libraries is a really interesting one. Generally speaking, if you try to do a community-based library in an affluent area, you will be sort of surrounded by volunteers wanting to do it, and that's not a problem. But you won't get that necessarily in such a deprived area. And so what we've worked with is one of the mental health trusts that we deal with has taken on 5 of our libraries. And so there was a political decision that we were not going to close any libraries, We had 43 libraries when we started. We've still got 43, but 26 of them are community run or run by health trusts.
Wow. When we talk about working with partners, health and others, is that successful? Have we cracked that? Is it working well? And if so, what are the lessons to learn about partnership working?
I don't think we've got it quite right with health and social care. So we talk about integration, it's not quite there yet. So for example, we, right at the beginning of the pandemic when we had the clap for carers and so on, and then social care was just missed out. We had a badge. Then it's been brought back, and thankfully now social care is on the agenda, which is great. It's better than it was. I think there are lots of good stuff. We shouldn't be negative about things. There are lots of good stuff that's happening, really. But I think it's about, I go back to my original point when we opened, this is really about trust and allowing people to try and find the solutions. So I think of two national campaigns that happened. So we had the NHS Good Sam launch of that app, and there was a phenomenal response of people wanting to volunteer, and there's a huge database of people that are still on the NHS Good Sam app. So that shows you there's an outpouring of community, kindness, compassion, however you want to label it, but people want to help. The other thing is the Marcus Rashford free school meals. It was, again, a phenomenal response to people recognising that children need feeding, but the wider debate is around wider poverty. It's not just about food, it's about you can give people a food parcel. If they haven't got any fuel to cook it on, then how does that solve things? If kids haven't got a winter coat or winter shoes. But actually, the strength of those campaigns resonated with people. So I think it's about our messaging. What is it we're trying to achieve? How do we bring people with us? And more fundamentally, trusting people to have a role in that, believing that they can do it. And as John said earlier on, we might not get it right all of the time, but we have to give it a damn good go and try it. And this is what we've done throughout this pandemic, and we have to build on that.
We're being asked a question about, are strong communities nice to have, or do we need to recognise that local communities have a fundamental right to health, a decent standard of living, and most importantly, to determine for themselves how to achieve these goals? Are they nice to have, or do they have rights?
Well, I think yes, they should be viewed in that way, because actually the power should be with them. So it's got to be a right, hasn't it, from that perspective? I think to come back to your previous question also, it's about that right is of course much more easy to achieve in some communities than in others. Interestingly, if you look at some of the genesis of the Barking and Dagenham work, it was their analysis and understand that in-work poverty was one of their key issues. If you look at East Ayrshire, it was depopulation of towns because of the history of deep mining. So actually, where you are seeing some of this great flowering of community enablement, it is in some of the most intractable areas. So I think that does show that those authorities have recognised that is a right for their population, and actually they're going about doing something about it, but in a very different way. And obviously in John's case, there's that three-tier version. So there are lots of different versions of it, and say in Scotland it's across public sector statutory basis for it. So I think there's a lot that we could learn from each other, not universal lessons you can apply everywhere, but you could actually take bits and say, actually that bit will work for my community, that'll work for my community, and it might be different elsewhere. But if we can share those lessons, I think we can deliver the rights, and actually really also help people to take that responsibility as well that goes with it.
Some think tank work suggests that it's about ceding power to the community, and if you give them power, then they're going to be able to do for themselves. Is it that simple?
Well, I'll use the example of the community hubs, if you like, in Trafford, because I think it's not that simple, and people will always need support, but it's about what levels of support you offer. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw lots of leaflets going out with individual mobile numbers, little WhatsApp groups being set up, but one of the things was about how do we make sure some of the more vulnerable people were protected in communities and weren't potentially being scammed, as sometimes happens. So Trafford made a decision that it wasn't going to be an officer-led offer. I got the voluntary and community sector together. They're best placed to know what their community needs, Friends of Stretford Public Hall. They took the public hall over as a community asset. The work that they do there has been incredible. So I think it's a bit about, what do people need support with? Do they need to access funding? Can we support them with that? Do they need support with some of the logistics and practical things? But it's not, of course, it's not easy just to say, right, over to you. It should be that reciprocal and collaborative relationship. That's ultimately what I think the goal should be, local government working with local communities to find the solutions that they need.
We've been asked the question, is the issue around moving money from local government directly to the community? Should we give the budgets to the community to spend?
I think that assumes, first of all, that we've got a budget to give, and that's the difficult one. And also the fact that they would then necessarily do the same things that we have done. And I don't think either of those two things are true. I think that actually, again, you have to look at it as a way of deconstructing what we currently do, releasing that as much of that resource as you can, and putting the power of that into the community. But you've got to evolve the community in the design of that. You can't just go, here you go. So there's certainly when we've seen the way in which authorities have looked at, for example, how their localities teams work, which is pre-actually doing anything, what they've done is involve local business, local communities in working out what that service is and how it works. So even the transfer has been co-designed, if you like. Actually, what that's done is release more resource. So the sort of resource that's coming out in the pandemic, actually authorities that have gone down that co-design, we're already releasing resource from the community several years ago in some particular cases that we've seen. So I don't think it's about, taking a box and shifting it from one side of a wall to another. It's about knocking the wall down and saying, okay, how do we design what's going to exist here afterwards together?
I think if I could just come in and say, the thing about the rights is really interesting, and that conversation about, it is a conversation, because when you sort of, an ethicist would tell you there's 4 elements to a right. There's the person claiming it, there's the person receiving it, there's what they're claiming in terms of the right, but there's also then, there's what they're going to do to earn that right. And so therefore a right is a relationship, not a sort of one-way thing. And I would say the same around the budgets. And I think that's where we need to get right, and we try to with the parishes and with these, and actually in this COVID response, often it's just neighbourhood groups that have come to us and said, we'd like to do more, we'd like to sort of represent our areas and help out. And I keep coming back to that thing and say, they're not going to do 100% of what we want them to do, because they're volunteers. We need to accept that they say, we want to do this much. We say, that's fine, we'll do this bit, you do that bit, and then let's have a conversation about it.
We've been asked another question, how has the role of local government changed and the dynamics between the council and the community? And in that, I might add, are local elections sufficient accountability for councils, or do we need other things in place? So in that regard, there's been some talk about job profiles or role profiles for members, the potential for published performance standards. Now, there are some that agree with that and say, normally on the officer side, and say that makes more sense, it makes it clearer. Others that say it's a political role, it's not about being an officer and being subject to the same issues. So wrapped up in that, has the role of local government changed? The dynamics between council and community, is there enough accountability?
Well, as somebody that is in the hugely privileged position to be an elected representative and have the portfolio for social care, I want to be transparent, accessible and accountable, and I certainly believe that should be a given, if you like, for a local councillor. The question about has local government changed, it's had to change and it's had to adapt to a pandemic situation. And I think certainly, again, I can only speak from Trafford, there's definitely been a cultural change in some of the officers around how we engage with communities. And let's face it, we've all had to work very differently. The town hall, which is seen as the beacon and the ivory tower of local government, people aren't working at the town hall anymore. Lots more people are working from home. They're having to adapt. And as I've said, we're all human beings trying to get through this the best way that we can. I think local government has changed. lots of positives that we have to build on, and connecting with our communities is going to be critical over the next couple of weeks and months as we go into winter.
I would just come in, if I may. I think we get really excellent value from our councillors. I am utterly astounded how much time they put in for the reward they get, both financial and some of the stick they put up with. And actually, while it's important there's openness and there's transparency and all the rest of it, I think we've got to keep, attracting those public-spirited people to come into local politics and represent their places. And I think that's an area where we sort of probably need to sort of put an awful lot more effort going forward. And I know that certainly, we're going into an election next year, and it'd be interesting to see who, because at one stage in Staffordshire they didn't like the idea of what they called double hatters, people who were boroughs and county councillors. In some areas we haven't got much choice because there aren't that many people for any of the parties coming forward to stand, and I think that's the worry for local government. And I think that the people we've got are absolutely outstanding, but we need to keep that supply chain moving.
We've got another question about digital communication, and does it cause more isolation for some people, and how do you communicate to those isolated people? Certainly there is much more reliance on digital across the board. Certainly now with home working, there's a lot of reliance on digital home working. Does it cause isolation, and how do you overcome it?
I think you get to choose, and that's I always say in this organisation is that before the pandemic, although we'd been sort of pushing on smart working because we are a 77% female organisation, average age of 48, smart working suits my colleagues. It works well for their lifestyle, and I think it was more a cultural approach we took to it than a technology-led approach. But even then, before the pandemic, we were pretty much over here on that everything was happening face to face. Now we're pretty much over here, where pretty much everything is happening virtually. That pendulum will probably swing back. Where it stops, we get to choose, and what we need to choose is which activities it is that work best face-to-face and which activities we can keep online. And I think that goes down to the isolation, because for some people, it's absolutely super. They really like it. For other people, they really struggle with the idea of not having that interaction. And I would say I'm in that latter camp. I really like being around people.
For me, it's actually, you can see both. Don't forget, it's not just digital communication in the sense of, we're talking to each other or email and social media. I mean, you're talking about technology, monitoring alarms in the home that give people independence. But in that context, if it's just remote monitoring, that can create isolation. Actually, without the community involvement in that, actually you can create someone who's perfectly able to look after themselves more and monitored from a distance, and that's it. And that would be terrible. On the other hand, you've got great examples of where digital approaches have given a voice to vulnerable communities. And the one that I love the most, a great fan of, is Mind of My Own, the app that's used for children going through the sort of system, and that enables those children to say how they are, how they're feeling, good and bad, and actually gives the authority effectively an intelligence on what their young people are thinking, and actually being able to respond to it more effectively. So you've got both sides of the coin. As long as you, when you're planning out what you're doing, actually recognise that what you're trying to do is use that communication method to give voice to the different communities, and you follow that line, I think you can be really successful. But if you don't, you do suffer the danger of the technology is monitoring the person, I don't have to talk to them, and that would be a crime. So it's I think that we're going on the right path personally, but there's more to do.
Well, we're down to our last minute or so. Any last comments that you would like to make?
I think, just going back to the digital, really, it does work for some people, absolutely that. It isn't the answer for everything. Lots been said about digital connections. It's not the answer for everything. You can't beat having that human contact. And just to round up, as I've said, really, it's about learning from some great examples that we've had over the last couple of weeks and months, and shining a light on our communities and saying, do you know what, you've done a fantastic job. Let's have some more of that.
John, any last comments?
No, I would just reiterate exactly what Jan's just said. I think that's spot on.
Thank you. So with that, I bring this TED Talk to an end. The next session will be a live Q&A with Certificate of Excellence winners and the UK Council of the Year. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.